Las Vegas appears first as light, an endless spill of it, glowing so brightly it seems capable of erasing shadows. From the airplane window, the city looks like a promise that can't be broken. Gold red, electric blue, a place designed to make you believe that nothing bad can last very long here, because even night is artificial, carefully managed, always losing to neon. For most people, arrival in Las Vegas feels like stepping into a pause in real life. Bills, arguments, unfinished thoughts, they all stay behind at the airport baggage claim. What happens here is meant to stay here. What happens here is not supposed to follow you home. The traveler arrives like millions before them. A holiday trip, a short escape from routine. Not a reinvention, just a break. A few days where the rules loosen, where time blurs, where nobody asks too many questions. The city welcomes them without curiosity. It never asks who you are or why you came. It only asks how long you plan to stay, and how much you're willing to lose. At first, everything unfolds the way it should. A hotel room with curtains that don't quite close. A view of traffic flowing like a restless river. Elevators that smell faintly of perfume and exhaustion. The casino floor hums constantly, a low mechanical heartbeat that never sleeps. Voices overlap, languages collide, laughter spikes and dissolves. Everywhere, people are arriving and leaving at the same time, dragging small suitcases behind them like anchors that never quite touch the ground. In a city built on motion, standing still feels unnatural. The traveler blends in perfectly. That is the first problem, though no one realizes it yet. They are not remarkable enough to stand out, not invisible enough to raise concern. Just another body moving through corridors designed to absorb people and release them unchanged. They walk beneath chandeliers, past security cameras, across patterned carpets that seem engineered to confuse the sense of direction. They eat, they sleep, they wander. Maybe they gamble a little. Maybe they don't. None of it matters. None of it will matter later, either. What matters is how ordinary it all feels. On the surface, there is no danger, no warning signs, no dramatic argument caught on camera, no frantic phone call, no visible fear. If anything, the city feels indulgent, excessive, alive. Las Vegas doesn't feel like a place where people disappear. It feels like a place where people hide for a while, then return home with stories they exaggerate just enough to make them interesting. But disappearance doesn't always announce itself. It begins quietly, with a missed checkout time, a phone that goes unanswered, a room key that stops working. Housekeeping knocks once, twice, then opens a door to a room that looks paused mid-thought. Bed untouched, bathroom unused, no suitcase gone, no sign of struggle, just absence, laid out so neatly it feels intentional. At first, the assumption is simple. They must be out, sleeping it off somewhere, lost track of time. In Las Vegas, that happens constantly. People disappear for hours, sometimes days, and reemerge with nothing more than a headache and a story they half remember. Staff are trained not to panic. Panic is bad for business. So the city waits. Hours pass. Then a full day. The lights outside never dim enough to mark the passage of time. The traveler does not return. Their phone remains silent. Messages pile up, then stop. Somewhere far away, someone begins to feel that tight, irrational sensation, the one that arrives before logic, before proof. The feeling that something has gone wrong in a way that cannot be undone. When a concern finally reaches authorities, it does not arrive as urgency. It arrives as paperwork. A name, a description, a last known location that could describe half the city. Las Vegas processes missing people the same way it processes everything else. Efficiently, impersonally, and without attachment. The Strip alone swallows tens of thousands of visitors every night. People leave without notice all the time. The difference between leaving and vanishing is often invisible at first. Security footage is reviewed, or parts of it are. The traveler appears here, then there, a lobby, a hallway, a moment near an exit that leads somewhere vague and unremarkable. The footage does not tell a story. It only proves existence for a few seconds at a time. After that, there is nothing. No image of them leaving the city. No image of them returning to the room. No clear direction. The cameras blink, the timestamps jump, and the trail dissolves. Las Vegas is one of the most surveilled cities in the world, and yet it specializes in gaps. Days turn into weeks. The initial concern softens into confusion, then into something quieter and more dangerous. Acceptance. Not full acceptance, just enough to allow delay, just enough to move the case to the bottom of a stack. There is no blood, no crime scene, no ransom, no public pressure. Without spectacle, the disappearance fails to compete with the city's constant demand for attention. Meanwhile, the city continues as if nothing has changed. New tourists arrive under the same glowing signs. They take photos in the same spots. They walk the same corridors. They never notice the empty space where someone else's life stopped moving. The hotels are cleaned. The room is reassigned. Sheets are replaced. Whatever faint trace of presence existed is erased with professional efficiency. What remains is a question that feels almost impolite to ask here. How does a person vanish in a place designed to see everything? Las Vegas teaches you that attention is selective, that brightness can conceal as effectively as darkness, that when everything is loud, silence becomes impossible to detect. The city is not cruel, it is indifferent. It does not chase you, but it will not follow you either. If you fall out of step, it keeps moving. Somewhere in the noise and movement, a line is crossed. Not dramatically, not violently, just a moment where no one is watching closely enough. A door that leads somewhere unexpected. A decision made in seconds. A misinterpretation. Or something far more deliberate. Hidden beneath layers of normalcy. At this stage of the story, no one knows which. All that is known is this. A holiday trip began the way millions do. Under lights that promise freedom and forgetting. And then, without explanation, one person failed to leave. Failed to return. Failed to exist in any place that could be pointed to with certainty. In Las Vegas, absence does not scream. It blends in, and that is what makes it dangerous. Before the disappearance became a question, before it hardened into a case number and a timeline full of blank spaces, there was a person living an ordinary, unfinished life. Not a mystery, not a headline, just someone moving through days that felt both familiar and unresolved, carrying thoughts they didn't always share out loud. They were not running from anything in the obvious sense. No criminal past. No dramatic break. No note left behind. If you asked the people closest to them, they would have told you this trip was nothing more than a pause, a small reward, a change of scenery, a chance to breathe somewhere loud enough to drown out quieter worries. Las Vegas was chosen not because it was dangerous, but because it was anonymous. A place where no one expects depth and therefore never looks for it. In the weeks leading up to the trip, life continued in that subtle, uneven way that feels normal while you're inside it. Work obligations were met, though sometimes late. Messages were answered, though occasionally shorter than usual. There were moments of laughter, moments of irritation, moments of exhaustion that felt heavier than they should have. Nothing that would make someone say later, "I should have known." And that is the unsettling part. Friends remember small things. A distracted look during conversations. A habit of staring off mid-sentence, as if listening to something only they could hear. They spoke about the future, but vaguely, not with despair, just without detail. The kind of ambiguity that could mean anything or nothing at all. Family members remember reassurance. It's just a short trip. I'll be back soon. Promises made casually, the way people make them when they don't imagine a world where they won't be kept. There was no sense of goodbye, no emotional finality. If anything, the tone was lighter than usual, as though the trip itself carried the expectation of return, renewal, maybe even clarity. The traveler packed carefully, but not excessively. Enough clothes for a few days. Personal items that suggested intention, not escape. There was no attempt to erase themselves. No sudden closing of accounts. No severing of ties. Their life remained fully intact, waiting for them to step back into it. Emotionally, they were in a place many people recognize but rarely articulate. Not unhappy, but not settled. Caught between who they had been and who they weren't sure how to become next. That liminal space where reflection can feel urgent and distraction feels necessary. Las Vegas offered both noise and anonymity, indulgence and distance. It's tempting, after a disappearance, to search the past for hidden darkness, to believe there must have been a secret spiral, a breaking point that explains everything. But the truth here resists that simplicity. There were stressors, yes, everyone has them. Expectations that felt heavy, a sense of time moving faster than they were ready for. But there was also attachment, responsibility, love, plans that extended beyond the day of the trip. They booked the hotel themselves, chose the dates, shared details willingly. There was no attempt to vanish quietly. If anything, they left traces everywhere, digital confirmations, travel itineraries, casual comments to coworkers about where they'd be staying. Their presence was documented, anchored, real. Psychologically, they were not someone drifting away from the world. They were someone standing inside it, trying to adjust their footing. The idea of Las Vegas as a symbolic place matters here. It wasn't just a destination, it was permission. Permission to be unobserved without being suspicious. Permission to exist without explanation. In their everyday life, they were known, seen, defined by roles that came with expectations. In Las Vegas, those definitions would dissolve temporarily. Not forever. Just long enough to feel like themselves again, or perhaps like someone else. There were conversations, in retrospect, that take on a different weight. Offhand remarks about needing a break. Jokes about disappearing into the noise for a few days. The kind of language people use metaphorically, never imagining it might be taken literally later. At the time, no one noticed. There was no reason to. They boarded the plane carrying the same quiet contradictions most people do. Hope mixed with fatigue, anticipation threaded with unease. They were not fleeing. They were pausing. And pauses are supposed to be safe. When the plane landed, their life did not end. It simply stepped out of view. That distinction matters, because it reframes what comes next. This was not a person who wanted to be erased. This was not someone trying to disappear. Whatever happened later would not align with their emotional trajectory. It would not match the shape of their intentions, which is why the disappearance feels so violent. Even without violence, it is the interruption that unsettles, the sudden severing of a story that was still in motion, a person who was mid-sentence in their own life, removed without closure, without consent, without explanation. When loved ones later replay memories, they do not hear warning bells. They hear continuity. They hear someone expecting to come back. And that expectation lingers, long after logic suggests it shouldn't. Understanding who they were before they vanished doesn't solve the mystery. It deepens it. Because the more human they become, the harder it is to accept that they simply dissolved into background of the city built to consume and forget. They were not a ghost waiting to happen. They were a person who believed, like so many do, that leaving for a few days didn't require a contingency plan, that normal life would be there when they returned, that the world was structured enough, watched enough, predictable enough, to prevent someone from simply slipping out of it. That belief is what makes the disappearance feel like a betrayal, because whatever took them did not target a runaway or a reckless soul. It found someone ordinary, grounded, connected, someone whose absence would hurt in quiet, lasting ways. And that is why the story cannot end here. The last confirmed hours unfold without drama, which is what makes them so difficult to hold on to. No alarms, no raised voices, just a sequence of moments that only gained significance after they were already gone. The traveler is seen first in the hotel lobby, moving at an unhurried pace, not rushing, not lingering, dressed casually, blending into the current of people flowing past the front desk. The footage captures posture, but not intention. A glance toward the entrance, a brief pause near the elevators, then movement again, swallowed by the architecture. Time in Las Vegas doesn't move the way it does elsewhere. There are no natural markers, no sunset to signal the end of a day, no quiet hours to suggest rest. Inside the Strip, everything exists in a permanent state of now. That makes reconstructing timelines difficult. When someone says they saw the traveler earlier can mean 10 minutes ago or 10 hours ago. Memory stretches and collapses under artificial light. A receipt places them at a nearby casino. Or maybe it doesn't. The timestamp is smudged, the location ambiguous. Surveillance footage shows someone who could be them. Same height, similar clothing, standing at a gaming table, hands resting on the edge as if unsure whether to participate. The camera angle is poor, the resolution unforgiving. The moment ends before confirmation can arrive. There is no record of intoxication, no sign of erratic behavior. They do not appear lost or distressed. If anything, they seem contemplative, moving through the environment without urgency, as though thinking something through. But that interpretation is subjective, projected backward through the lens of disappearance. At some point, they are captured walking down a corridor that leads away from the main casino floor. It is not marked as restricted, not clearly public either. The kind of transitional space Las Vegas is full of: hallways designed to guide, redirect, confuse. Carpet patterns shift. Lighting dims slightly. The sound changes from constant noise to something more hollow. Then the footage ends. There's no clear exit captured. No moment where they step into a cab. No swipe of a keycard returning to the room. Their phone pings once more somewhere within range of a tower, then falls silent. No goodbye message. No final call. Just an abrupt cessation of digital presence, as though the signal itself lost interest. Investigators return to these final hours again and again, hoping repetition will produce clarity. It never does. Each viewing raises new questions without answering old ones. Why that direction? Why alone? Why no trace afterward in a city built on tracking movement? Eyewitness accounts offer little help. A bartender thinks they remember the traveler ordering a drink, but isn't certain. A rideshare driver recalls a passenger with similar features, but the destination doesn't match. In Las Vegas, faces blur quickly. People arrive pre-randomized, and memory obliges. The most unsettling aspect is what doesn't appear. There is no image of panic, no indication of coercion, no visible confrontation. Whatever happened did not announce itself in a way cameras were trained to detect. It slipped between frames, exploiting the blind spots created by scale and design. Casinos are watched constantly, but not comprehensively. Cameras prioritize tables, cash handling, points of financial risk. Hallways, stairwells, service corridors. These spaces exist in a quieter category of surveillance, monitored but not scrutinized unless something demands it. The traveler passes through these spaces without triggering interest. Time stretches. Hours pass without confirmation of location. The hotel room remains untouched. The bed pristine. The bathroom unused. The suitcase exactly where it was left. It's as though the traveler stepped out for a moment and never completed the thought. When staff first notice, it feels routine. People miss checkouts all the time. Some extend their stay without notifying the desk. Others leave early. Las Vegas thrives on unpredictability. Absence is common here. Absence is not alarming. Only later does absence begin to feel wrong. Investigators map possibilities. They could have left the hotel through an unmonitored exit. They could have entered another property, blending into the vast interconnected interior of the Strip. They could have gotten into a vehicle. They could have met someone. Each option opens into dozens more. The city offers too many ways to move unseen. The last known hours refuse to resolve into a story. They remain a collection of still images and partial data, disconnected and emotionally neutral. That neutrality is what frustrates those searching for meaning. There is no emotional spike to anchor interpretation, no visible turning point. And yet, something changed. The traveler crossed from known space into unknown space without leaving a marker behind. In a city designed to make people feel observed, they found a seam, a place where attention thinned just enough to allow disappearance. As days pass, those final hours become sacred in their scarcity. Loved ones study them obsessively, looking for signs that were never meant to be there. A hesitation in their walk, a tilt of the head, anything that might suggest awareness, fear, or decision. But the footage remains stubbornly mundane. That is the cruelty of it. The disappearance does not look like a disappearance. It looks like a person simply continuing their night. Las Vegas excels at turning movement into background noise. It conditions you not to notice transitions, not to question direction, not to ask why someone is going where they're going. The traveler moves within that system effortlessly until they do not emerge on the other side. The last confirmed hours do not explain what happened. They only prove that it happened quietly. And in a city that never pauses, quiet is the easiest thing to lose. The missing person report begins the way most of them do, not with urgency, but with hesitation. A question asked carefully, as if afraid of overreacting. A call placed after telling oneself repeatedly that there must be a reasonable explanation. In a city like Las Vegas, delay feels normal. People go offline. Plans dissolve. Time bends. No one wants to be the person who panics too early. By the time concern hardens into certainty, the city has already moved on. The report is taken at a desk that sees hundreds of similar faces each year. Names blur together. Stories overlap. The officer listens, types, nods. The questions are procedural, practiced. What were they wearing? When were they last seen? Any history of mental illness? Any reason they might leave voluntarily? Each answer is filtered through a quiet, unspoken calculation. Probability. Las Vegas handles missing persons differently than most places. Tourists complicate everything. Visitors arrive without routes, without local histories, without people nearby to notice changes in routine. They exist briefly, intensely, then disappear back into wherever they came from. When one fails to reappear, it does not automatically signal danger. Often, it signals nothing at all. The case is logged. A number is assigned. The system begins to work, but slowly, conservatively, with assumptions baked in. The first assumption is voluntary absence. The second is intoxication. The third is miscommunication. Only later, if at all, does a possibility of foul play move to foreground. Family members feel the shift immediately. The way voices change when they mention the city. The way officials reassure rather than investigate. These things happen. People lose track of time. Las Vegas can be overwhelming. Each sentence is delivered calmly, but lands like a dismissal. Time becomes the enemy. Security footage is requested, but much of it is overwritten within days. Casinos retain what they need, discard what they don't. By the time interest intensifies, some data is already gone, not hidden, just erased by routine. The city's efficiency works against the search. Hotel staff cooperate within limits. They provide records, key card logs, housekeeping reports. Everything confirms what is already known. The traveler did not return. But nothing points forward. The absence remains static, unhelpful. Investigators face an uncomfortable reality. There is no clear crime scene, no jurisdictional clarity. The strip spans multiple properties, private security teams, overlapping authorities. Responsibility fractures easily here. Each agency sees only part of the picture, and no one sees the whole. As days stretch into weeks, the tone changes. Calls are returned less urgently. Updates become vaguer. Phrases like "no new developments" and "still reviewing" begin to appear. For the system, this is stasis. For loved ones, it feels like abandonment. Emotionally, this is where hope starts to bruise. Families oscillate between reassurance and dread. They imagine scenarios where the traveler is alive, just unreachable. They cling to the idea of a lost phone, a spontaneous decision, a misunderstanding. But every passing day without contact corrodes those narratives. The most painful part is the quiet. There is no press conference, no public appeal, no urgency that forces the city to look up from itself. Without spectacle, the disappearance fails to compete with everything else Las Vegas produces daily. Celebrations, arrests, scandals, wins, losses. The case sits technically active but effectively frozen. Requests for deeper investigation meet soft resistance. Resources are limited. Evidence is thin. There are other cases with clearer signs of danger. The logic is understandable, but devastating. Absence alone does not justify intensity. Not here. At some point, the family realizes something essential. The system is not built to search endlessly for someone who vanished quietly. It is built to respond to disruption. Blood, noise, witnesses. The traveler left none of those behind. This realization changes the emotional texture of a search. It becomes less about trusting authorities and more about pushing against inertia. Loved ones begin to make calls themselves, retracing steps, asking questions that feel intrusive but necessary. They walk the strip, trying to feel where the city might have shifted. They encounter walls, some literal, some procedural. Security cites policy. Records are incomplete. Memories are unreliable. Everyone is polite but distant. Everyone has something else to attend to. The disappearance becomes smaller in public space and larger in private life. Weeks turn into months. The language used to describe the case subtly shifts. Missing becomes long-term missing. Follow-up becomes periodic review. These phrases sound neutral, but they carry an implication that is impossible to ignore. The expectation of return is fading. The most unsettling aspect is not that the investigation stalls. It's how normal that stall feels within the city's logic. Las Vegas is designed to absorb loss without acknowledging it. Money vanishes here constantly. Time disappears. People reinvent themselves and shed old identities. In that context, a missing person becomes just another unresolved variable. But for those waiting, time does not behave that way. Every unanswered call becomes louder. Every empty update feels heavier. The absence begins to take up space, shaping daily life around it. Birthdays pass. Holidays arrive and leave. The traveler remains frozen at the age they were when they vanished, while everyone else continues aging around the question. The report did not go nowhere because no one cared. It went nowhere because the system could not see what it was designed not to see. A disappearance without disruption, a loss without evidence. A person who slipped through not because they wanted to, but because there was room for them to fall. By the time anyone begins to wonder if something more sinister occurred, the trail is already cold. Not from neglect, but from delay, from assumptions, from a city that never stops long enough to notice who failed to keep up. And that is how the disappearance becomes permanent. Not through a single mistake, but through a series of reasonable pauses that add up to silence. The first rumors don't arrive loudly. They drift in from the margins, half-formed, easy to dismiss. A comment overheard. A story told late at night. Lower voices competing with background noise. In Las Vegas, rumors are as common as flashing lights, and most of them dissolve as quickly as they appear. At first, these do too. They begin as questions. Why do some people vanish without records? Why do certain minor arrests never surface in court databases? Why are there buildings on the Strip with architectural features that don't match their blueprints? None of these questions point directly to the missing traveler. They don't need to. They create an atmosphere, a sense that the city has layers most people never touch. The stories share a theme. People who slip into spaces that aren't meant to exist. A former casino employee mentions service corridors that lead farther than they should. A maintenance worker recalls doors that were never labeled, guarded not by visible security, but by the certainty that you weren't supposed to be there. Someone else talks about holding rooms used briefly, quietly, then forgotten. Not jails, not offices, something in between. At first, these accounts feel exaggerated, colored by years of distance and imagination. Las Vegas thrives on illusion. It builds entire worlds for entertainment. Why wouldn't it also inspire myths about what happens behind the scenes? But the rumors persist. They reappear in unrelated conversations, told by people who don't know each other, who have nothing to gain by inventing them. Each version is incomplete, but certain details repeat. The sense of disorientation, the absence of clocks, the inability to tell how long someone was held. The phrase that surfaces again and again is, off the books. Off the books means no paperwork, no charges, no acknowledgement. The traveler's family hears these stories accidentally at first. An online forum, a comment under an unrelated article, a message from someone who says, I don't know if this matters, but most of the time it doesn't. But occasionally, something aligns too closely to ignore. The rumors suggest that not all disappearances in Las Vegas are accidents or personal choices. Some are administrative. Some are the result of systems operating quietly, prioritizing order over transparency. People who don't fit neatly into legal categories. People who are inconvenient rather than dangerous. This is where the story begins to tilt. The idea of something hidden beneath the Strip feels implausible, and yet the Strip itself is built on concealment. Massive infrastructure runs below the surface. Tunnels, service roads, utility networks, designed to keep the spectacle uninterrupted. The public sees fantasy. Everything else is buried. It becomes easier to imagine how someone could be removed from view without leaving the city at all. Old news articles surface, half forgotten, mentions of detentions that were never fully explained, settlements without admissions of guilt, whistleblowers who spoke briefly, then stopped. Nothing conclusive, enough to disturb. One former detainee, using a pseudonym, describes being held after a misunderstanding that escalated quickly. No formal arrest, no clear charge, just containment, until things could be sorted out. They described the space as windowless, quiet, intentionally disorienting. When they were released, there was no documentation of the time they lost. Their story is dismissed by some as fabrication. Trauma often is, but others recognize the language, the way memory fractures when time is taken from you without explanation. As these accounts accumulate, the disappearance of the traveler begins to feel less isolated. Their case is no longer just a personal tragedy. It becomes a data point in a pattern that resists official acknowledgement. The emotional shift is subtle but profound. Hope transforms into vigilance. Grief becomes suspicion. The question is no longer where did they go, but who had the power to make them vanish? Still, everything remains unproven. Rumors do not equal evidence. Stories do not equal systems. And yet, they exert pressure. They change how the absence is understood. The silence no longer feels accidental. It feels maintained. Las Vegas is uniquely suited for this kind of secrecy. It is governed by overlapping jurisdictions, private interests, and an economy that depends on uninterrupted fantasy. Problems are solved quietly here. Messes hidden. Disruption is minimized. The idea that certain detentions could occur without public oversight stops sounding impossible. It starts sounding efficient. What unsettles a family most is how easily the rumors explain the gaps in the original investigation, the missing footage, the lack of jurisdictional clarity, the absence of records. These were once seen as failures. Now they resemble design features. But belief is dangerous. It can harden too quickly, turn speculation into certainty. The family resists that pull. They demand proof. They ask for documents. They file requests that come back incomplete or denied. Each denial feels small on its own. Together, they form a pattern of obstruction that mirrors the rumors too closely to ignore. The strip above continues to glow, untouched by these questions. Tourists pass over whatever lies beneath without awareness. The city performs its role perfectly, inviting, distracting, forgetful. Below that performance, something else may be operating. Not monstrous, not dramatic, just quiet, procedural, and shielded by complexity. The rumors don't provide answers. They don't confirm the traveler's fate. What they do is worse. They suggest that knowing might not be possible, that some systems are built not to resolve mysteries, but to contain them. And once that idea takes hold, the disappearance stops feeling like an anomaly. It starts feeling like part of the architecture. Once the rumors exist, the mind begins to arrange them, not into a conspiracy at first, but into a question of repetition. One story can be dismissed. Two can be coincidence. But when similarities stack on top of each other, across years, across names, across circumstances, the shape of something larger begins to emerge. It starts with lists. The family doesn't call them that, not at first. They're just notes, screenshots, clippings saved late at night, when sleep refuses to come. Names of people who vanished under conditions that feel uncomfortably familiar. Tourists who never boarded return flights. Temporary workers who stopped showing up. Individuals last seen near the Strip after minor incidents that never became formal charges. None of them are famous. None spark national outrage. They share a quiet quality, a lack of social gravity. People without platforms, without powerful advocates. People whose disappearance creates pain, but not disruption. As these cases accumulate, a pattern begins to surface, slow and unsettling. The disappearances cluster geographically. but not precisely. They don't all happen in the same casino, the same hotel, the same block. Instead, they orbit certain zones, transitional spaces, areas where public access blurs into private control, places where responsibility becomes difficult to assign. Many of the missing had brief encounters with authorities shortly before vanishing. Not arrests, not charges, interactions, security checks, requests for identification, situations described later as misunderstandings, moments that should have ended quickly and officially did, on paper, except the people never fully reappeared. In some cases, there are gaps measured in hours, in others, days, time lost without explanation, followed by silence. Families report similar experiences when they ask questions, delays, redirection, assurances without substance. A recurring phrase appears across jurisdictions: no record found. No record found does not mean nothing happened. It means nothing exists that can be acknowledged. Emotionally, this realization hits harder than any single rumor. Patterns imply intention. They suggest not randomness, but selection. Not chaos, but criteria. The traveler's disappearance begins to align with this emerging structure. Their last known movements, the absence of documentation afterward, the lack of clarity around jurisdiction. These were once frustrating anomalies. Now they feel like familiar components. The family reaches out to others quietly, cautiously. Conversations are careful, shaped by shared fear of being dismissed. Some families respond immediately, grateful to be seen. Others refuse to engage, having learned that hope can reopen wounds that never fully closed. The stories overlap in tone, if not in detail. The same early reassurances, the same eventual withdrawal of official interest, the same hollow space where answers should be. One parent describes it as falling through paperwork. Another says it feels like their loved one stepped outside the map. These metaphors recur without coordination, suggesting a shared experience of erasure rather than loss. What makes the pattern especially difficult to confront is its restraint. There is no spectacle, no mass disappearance, no single event that forces attention. The system, if it exists, operates precisely because it does not draw focus. It deals in individuals, not groups. It removes people quietly, one at a time, ensuring no critical mass of outrage ever forms. This is not the language of horror stories. It is the language of administration. The family begins to understand something deeply unsettling. If the traveler was taken into such a system, proving it may be impossible. Systems designed to operate without records do not fail by losing evidence. They succeed by never creating it. That realization reframes the search entirely. The question shifts from what happened to them to what kind of structure could make this disappearance look ordinary. Las Vegas offers several answers. Private security forces with broad discretion, memorandums of understanding between agencies, legal gray zones created to protect business interests and public image. The city is a patchwork of authority, optimized for efficiency and containment. In that environment, people who don't fit neatly, who cause minor disruption, confusion, or inconvenience, can be rerouted quietly, held temporarily, assessed, forgotten, not punished, not rescued, just paused. The emotional weight of this possibility is immense. It transforms grief into something colder and more corrosive. The fear that the traveler was not lost to chance, but the process, that their individuality was irrelevant to whatever decision removed them from view. Still, doubt remains. Patterns can deceive. Humans are wired to find meaning in randomness, especially when pain demands explanation. The family wrestles with this constantly. They question their own conclusions. They seek contradiction. They look for cases that don't fit. But even the inconsistencies feel consistent. Some people reappear after days, shaken and unable to explain where they were. Others never return at all. The variability does not disprove the pattern. It suggests flexibility. What emerges is not a single story, but a framework. One that explains why disappearances don't trigger alarms. Why investigations stall without visible obstruction. Why so many families report the same emotional exhaustion, the same sense of pushing against something smooth and impenetrable. The traveler's case becomes part of a shadow archive, informal, incomplete, emotionally charged. A collection of absences that resist formal recognition, but refuse to fade. This is a point where the mystery stops feeling personal and starts feeling structural. And that is far more frightening, because structures do not feel guilt. They do not remember faces. They do not revisit decisions unless forced. If the traveler was absorbed into such a system, then their disappearance was not a mistake. It was a function. The strip above continues to pulse, unaware, or perhaps aware but uninterested. The city's brilliance depends on what remains unseen, on the promise that nothing behind the scenes will interrupt the performance. The pattern suggests that this promise has been kept at a cost few ever notice. By the end of this realization, the family understands something painful and irreversible. Solving this case may require exposing something far larger than a single disappearance. And systems, when threatened, do not reveal themselves willingly. They tighten, and somewhere within that tightening, the traveler remains unreachable. Not because no one is looking, but because the space they may occupy was never meant to be found. The first piece of evidence doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't arrive with confession, or a leaked file stamped confidential. It arrives as an inconsistency, something that doesn't align with the official version of how space is supposed to exist. It begins with a building. From the outside, it's unremarkable, one of many structures near the Strip, designed to blend into the visual noise of the city. No signs that invite attention. No features that demand curiosity. It appears functional, forgettable. The kind of place your eyes slide past without registering. But when its public records are examined closely, something feels wrong. The blueprints don't match the physical layout. Measurements are off. Certain areas appear to extend farther than they should. Rooms that exist in practice are missing on paper. Maintenance logs reference zones that have no official designation. None of this is enough on its own to suggest something secretive. Bureaucracy is messy. Buildings evolve. Documentation lags behind reality. Except this isn't isolated. Other structures show similar discrepancies. Minor ones. Subtle ones. Patterns that only become visible when compared side by side. Shared architectural features that don't make sense for their stated purposes. Reinforced sections where none are required. Access points that lead nowhere on official maps. When questioned, explanations are provided. Renovations, security upgrades, proprietary design, all technically plausible, all incomplete. Then testimony begins to surface. A former private contractor, no longer tied by non-disclosure agreements, describes working on a subterranean space that was never referenced by name. Access was restricted. Instructions were specific and compartmentalized. No one was allowed to understand the project as a whole. Their job was to build, not to ask. They recall features that stand out not for brutality, but for restraint. Sound-dampened walls, indirect lighting, materials chosen for durability rather than comfort. Nothing that would raise alarms if seen individually. Together, they form a space optimized for containment without visibility. Another source, an individual who claims to have been held there briefly, describes a place that feels intentionally disorienting. No windows, no clocks, no indication of time passing. They were never told where they were or why. Questions were met with silence or repetition. You'll be processed. This won't take long. Time stretched until it lost meaning. When they were released, there was no paperwork, no explanation, no acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred. It was as if the experience existed outside reality, leaving only psychological residue behind. These accounts are not identical. They don't need to be. Their alignment lies in structure, not detail. Each points toward a facility that operates in the negative space of the law, not illegal, exactly, but unaccountable. A place that exists precisely because it is never named. The phrase secret prison begins to circulate, though it feels imprecise. This is not a penitentiary. There are no sentences here, no convictions, no public oversight. It is a holding space designed for people who cannot or should not, be processed through conventional systems. The rationale, when inferred, is chilling in its pragmatism. Las Vegas depends on order. Disruption threatens revenue, reputation, and control. Most problems are managed quietly, but some situations resist easy resolution. Some individuals complicate narratives. Some incidents raise questions no one wants to answer publicly. So the system absorbs them temporarily, removes them from visibility, buys time. In most cases, release follows. Quietly, without acknowledgement, the person returns disoriented, often unable or unwilling to articulate what happened. Trauma does that. So does fear. Without documentation, there is nothing to contest. But occasionally, something goes wrong. A delay becomes indefinite. A temporary hold loses its endpoint. A person remains contained not because of malice, but because of inertia. No one notices. No one checks. The system assumes resolution without confirming it. This is where the traveler re-enters the narrative with terrifying clarity. Their disappearance aligns perfectly with this structure. A brief interaction. A movement into transitional space. A vanishing that leaves no official trace. Not because records were destroyed, but because none were created in the first place. The exposure of the facility is not a single moment. It unfolds through accumulation, documents obtained through persistence, testimonies shared under anonymity, architectural evidence that resists dismissal. Each piece reinforces the others. Authorities respond cautiously. Denials are careful, precise. They do not say the facility does not exist. They say it is misunderstood, mischaracterized. They emphasize safety, necessity, jurisdictional complexity. Language designed to soothe without revealing. The public reaction is muted at first. The story is difficult to grasp. There are no images, no dramatic footage, no clear villain. The concept itself feels abstract, a place that exists but isn't acknowledged, doing things that are legal enough to avoid scrutiny. But for those who've been searching for years, the exposure lands like confirmation, not resolution. Confirmation. The traveler may not have vanished into nothingness. They may have been taken somewhere deliberately designed to erase time, identity, and accountability. A place where being alive does not mean being free, and being held does not mean being charged. The idea reframes everything. The early delays, the missing footage, the stalled investigation. These were not failures. They were boundaries. The secret prison once imagined now feels obvious in hindsight. A solution created by a city that cannot afford unpredictability. A mechanism that functions precisely because it does not announce itself. And once it is seen, it cannot be unseen. The question is no longer whether the facility exists. The evidence suggests it does, in some form. The question now is far more unsettling. How many people passed through it without anyone ever asking where they went? And how many never came back out? What defines a place is not what it does, but how it feels. Those who describe being inside struggle to find language for it first, not because the memories are blocked, but because experience resists narrative. There are no clear beginnings or endings, no markers that tell the mind where one moment stops and another begins. Time, as it is normally understood, simply loosens and drifts apart. The first sensation is quiet, not silence. There is always some sound, but a controlled absence of randomness. No traffic, no voices bleeding through walls, no cues from the outside world. The quiet feels engineered, intentional, as if noise itself is considered a liability. It creates the impression that nothing is happening, even when something clearly is. People are led, not escorted. Directions are given without explanation. Movement happens through corridors that look similar enough to erase a sense of orientation. Lighting is steady, neither harsh nor comforting, bright enough to prevent sleep from feeling natural, dim enough to make concentration difficult. There are no windows. The absence of windows matters more than people expect. Without them, the mind loses its relationship to time almost immediately. There is no sense of morning or night, no shadow movement, no changing color of light. Days do not pass. They accumulate indistinctly, blending together until duration becomes meaningless. Those held there are not treated violently. That detail confuses many people when they first hear these accounts. Violence leaves marks. Violence creates witnesses. This place is designed to avoid both. Control is exerted through routine, repetition, and uncertainty. Questions are deflected, not denied. You'll be informed. This is temporary. Just cooperate. The language never escalates. It does not need to. The lack of information does the work on its own. Meals arrive without ceremony. Food is adequate, deliberately unremarkable. Not punishment, not comfort, just sustenance, stripped of pleasure or ritual. Even eating becomes dissociated from time. You eat when it appears. You stop when it's taken away. Sleep becomes fragmented. Without natural cues, the body drifts in and out of rest unpredictably. Some describe sleeping too much, others barely at all. Dreams blur into waking thoughts. Memory begins to behave strangely, reshuffling events out of order. The most consistent sensation reported is disorientation, not panic, not terror, but something quieter and more corrosive, a feeling of being unmoored, of existing in a holding pattern with no sense of progression. Identity begins to soften at the edges. Without names being used, without mirrors, without external confirmation, people report feeling themselves recede. Not disappear exactly, but thin out. They become observers of their own reactions rather than participants. This dissociation is not accidental. It is a psychological byproduct of containment without context. Occasionally, someone is spoken to directly. Ask questions that feel incomplete. Where were you headed? Who were you with? The tone is neutral, administrative. Answers do not produce visible reactions. There is no feedback loop. You speak, but nothing changes. This creates a specific kind of despair, the sense that agency has been suspended, not removed. You are not punished for speaking, but you are not rewarded either. Action loses meaning. Those who are eventually released describe a moment as anticlimactic. No explanation, no apology. One moment, they are told to follow instructions. The next, they are outside, disoriented, returned to a city that feels unreal after prolonged sensory deprivation. Some are dropped near familiar locations. Others find themselves blocks away from where they remember last being. Their phones may or may not be returned. Time gaps vary wildly. Hours, days, in rare cases, longer. When they ask questions afterward, they encounter confusion or denial. No record of detention. No acknowledgement of where they were. The experience exists only in memory, which quickly begins to feel unreliable under pressure. This is where many stop talking, not because they are threatened, but because the cost of speaking becomes apparent. Without proof, stories are reframed as confusion, intoxication, mental health episodes. Friends listen politely, then change the subject. Authorities express concern without action. The absence of validation deepens the trauma. For those who are not released, the experience remains theoretical, but its psychological logic applies all the same. If the traveler entered such a space, the initial hours would not have felt catastrophic. They would have expected explanation, expected processing, expected resolution. That expectation is what makes prolonged uncertainty so damaging. Hope becomes a liability. It stretches time unbearably. Inside a place like this, time does not just pass, it erodes. Days without reference points collapse into each other. The mind begins to conserve energy by narrowing focus. Long-term thinking fades. The future becomes abstract. Survival is not threatened, but continuity is. The self becomes something to maintain rather than express. This is how people can be held without visible suffering and still emerge profoundly altered. It is also how someone could disappear without a trace while still being alive. The idea challenges basic assumptions about captivity. We are conditioned to imagine prisons as loud, violent, obvious. This is the opposite. This is a space that relies on restraint, compliance, and ambiguity. It does not break bodies. It dissolves context. If the traveler was taken here, their disappearance was not a single event. It was a process. First, removal from public space. Then, removal from time. Finally, removal from narrative. No one outside knows where to look. because the place is not designed to be found. No one inside knows how long they've been there, because duration is intentionally obscured. And no one documents the experience, because documentation would create accountability. The horror, if it can be called that, is subtle. It is a horror of being suspended rather than destroyed, of being held in a state where existence continues. But life does not. When people ask why someone wouldn't fight, wouldn't scream, wouldn't leave evidence, they misunderstand the environment. Resistance requires clarity. It requires an understanding of stakes, of timeline, of possibility. In a place where none of those are provided, resistance feels premature, even irrational. You wait, because waiting is the only action that seems to make sense. That waiting, stretched across indeterminate time, becomes the experience itself. And if release never comes, if the system simply fails to reverse the hold, then the disappearance becomes permanent not through decision, but through neglect. The traveler's absence begins to feel different when viewed through this lens. Not dramatic, not violent, just prolonged, extended beyond what the outside world can imagine, until the question of where they becomes inseparable from whether the system ever intended to let them go. Inside the secret prison, existence does not end. It simply stops moving forward. Once the existence of the facility becomes plausible, the original disappearance cannot remain the same. It demands to be re-examined, not emotionally, but structurally. Every small detail that once felt meaningless now carries potential weight. The story does not change, but its interpretation does. The traveler's last movements are revisited with new eyes. That hallway, the one that led away from the main floor, at the time, it seemed ordinary, just another passage in a city full of them. Now it reads differently. Transitional spaces are where control shifts, where public ends and private begins, where authority can change hands without announcement. The absence of footage beyond that point no longer feels like coincidence. It feels like boundary. The lack of a formal arrest, once a point of confusion, now feels consistent. If the system operates without charges, then there would be no reason for documentation. No booking photo, no fingerprinting, no court record. The traveler would not appear in any database because they were never meant to. This reframing is devastating in its simplicity. Moments that once suggested randomness now suggest design. The calmness captured on camera, the absence of distress, the compliance implied by the footage. If someone believes they are being temporarily redirected, questioned, verified, processed, they do not panic. They follow instructions. They assume logic will assert itself. That assumption becomes a trap. The traveler's phone signal cutting off abruptly takes on new significance. Not broken, not lost, simply removed from an environment where connectivity exists. Inside controlled spaces, isolation is immediate and total. The hotel room, untouched, stops feeling like evidence of sudden departure and starts feeling like evidence of interruption. The traveler did not pack because they did not plan to leave. They did not return because they were prevented. Even the delays in reporting the disappearance align uncomfortably well. If the system relies on time to erase urgency, then every hour of assumption works in its favor. By the time questions sharpen, the moment has passed. The family begins to reconstruct the day minute by minute, not looking for emotion, but for access points. Where could the traveler have been diverted? Who would have had authority? Which jurisdiction would claim responsibility, and which would quietly decline it? They find nothing conclusive, but they find alignment. What once felt like investigative failure now reads as structural resistance, not active obstruction, something subtler, a landscape designed to diffuse responsibility so completely that no single actor can be held accountable. Emotionally, this shift is brutal. It replaces the ambiguity of loss with the cruelty of possibility. The traveler may not be dead. They may have been alive for hours, days, longer, aware, waiting, expecting release that never came. Hope becomes dangerous again, but this time it is edged with anger. The idea that someone could be held without charge, without acknowledgement, without oversight, long enough to vanish in their own life, redefines the meaning of disappearance. It is no longer about distance. It is about containment. The family grapples with a question that has no safe answer. If the traveler enters such a system, what is their status now? There is no record of release, no reappearance, no fragment of proof that they ever exited. But there is also no proof that they did not. This ambiguity is not accidental. It is the system's most powerful defense. Publicly, responses remain cautious. Officials acknowledge the facility's existence in vague terms, framing it as a misunderstanding, a mischaracterization. They emphasize safeguards, oversight, necessity. They do not address individual cases. They do not confirm or deny involvement. The traveler's name is never spoken in these contexts. For the family, this silence is confirmation of a different kind. If nothing happened, denial would be easy. If something happened but was acceptable, explanation would follow. Silence suggests neither. It suggests exposure without accountability. Recontextualizing the disappearance does not bring closure. It strips away comforting illusions. It replaces the randomness of fate with the indifference of systems. It suggests that what happened was not tragic in the cinematic sense, but procedural. That is harder to mourn. The traveler is no longer imagined as lost in the city, making a fatal mistake, or encountering a violent stranger. They are imagined in waiting rooms without clocks, in corridors without markers, in a suspended state where identity slowly erodes. This image is unbearable, and yet it fits too well to ignore. Friends and extended family struggle with this reframing. Some reject it outright. It feels too dark, too accusatory, too destabilizing. Others accept it immediately, finding in it an explanation that finally accounts for the absence of evidence. The division itself becomes another wound. What remains constant is the sense that the truth, whatever it is, exists beyond reach, not hidden behind locked doors, but behind layers of normalization, behind language that renders extraordinary actions ordinary. The traveler's disappearance, once a singular tragedy, now feels like an example, a case study in how modern systems can make people vanish without violence, without malice, and without leaving a mark. The emotional weight shifts again, from grief to responsibility. If this interpretation is correct, then forgetting becomes complicity. Silence becomes permission. The family understands that even without proof, the story must be told. Not because it will bring the traveler back, but because it exposes a mechanism that depends on invisibility. The disappearance, recontextualized, is no longer just about what happened to one person. It is about how easily someone can be removed from the world when the system decides they're easier to hold than to explain. And that understanding refuses to stay contained. Developer mode, when the existence of the facility becomes public. Partially, carefully, wrapped in language meant to reassure rather than explain. The reaction is strangely muted. There is no single moment of reckoning, no dramatic collapse of secrecy. Instead, the truth leaks out in fragments, diluted by qualifiers and framed as clarification rather than exposure. Officials acknowledge that certain temporary holding locations exist. They emphasize safety, necessity, jurisdictional cooperation. They insist these spaces are used rarely, responsibly, and always within the bounds of the law. What they do not provide are names, location, timelines, or oversight mechanisms that can be independently verified. The revelation feels like a door opening just wide enough to prove there is something behind it, then stopping. For the public, the story is difficult to digest. It does not conform to familiar narratives of wrongdoing. There are no images to circulate, no dramatic footage, no villains with faces. The concept itself feels abstract, administrative detention, off-the-books containment, legal gray zones. It competes poorly with louder scandals. Attention drifts. For the families of the missing, the impact is seismic. This is the moment they have been waiting for and dreading all at once. Validation arrives, but not relief. The acknowledgement confirms their worst suspicions while offering nothing that resembles resolution. The system admits to existing, but refuses to account for its consequences. Requests for records are filed immediately. Names are submitted. Dates. Locations. Each request is answered carefully, narrowly. No record found. No information available. Not applicable. The language is precise enough to be technically truthful and broad enough to be emotionally devastating. The traveler's case is raised again, now with urgency sharpened by context. The response does not change. There is no confirmation that they were held. There is no denial either, just procedural opacity. A vacuum where answers should live. Investigations are announced. Committees are formed. Oversight is promised. The language of accountability fills press releases. But these processes move slowly, and their scope is limited by design. They examine policy, not outcomes. Structure, not individuals. Years pass without names being named. The most painful realization for family is not that justice is denied, but that it is endlessly deferred. Every step forward is met with another layer of review, another jurisdictional handoff, another reminder that proving absence is far harder than proving presence. The system does not need to destroy evidence to protect itself. It only needs to outlast those asking questions. Some former detainees come forward during this period. Their accounts gain brief attention, then fade. Without documentation, their stories are framed as personal experiences rather than systemic failures. Trauma becomes anecdote. Memory becomes liability. The public discourse settles into discomfort. There is acknowledgement that something exists, coupled with an unspoken agreement not to look too closely. The idea that people may have been held without charge is unsettling, but the absence of spectacle makes it easy to compartmentalize. The city continues to function. The strip remains full. Nothing visibly changes. Exposure, it turns out, is not the same as accountability. For the traveler's family, the emotional toll deepens. The hope that exposure would unlock answers dissolves into a quieter, heavier grief. Not the grief of loss, but the grief of knowing that the truth may be permanently inaccessible. They are left with a paradox. The disappearance is no longer invisible, yet remains unresolved. This kind of unresolved truth is uniquely cruel. It prevents closure while demanding endurance. It keeps the wound open without offering a path to healing. The family learns to live inside that tension, adjusting expectations downward while refusing to let go entirely. They become experts in restraint. They choose words carefully. They avoid claims they cannot prove. They speak in questions, not accusations. This measured tone earns them credibility, but costs them momentum. Anger would be easier to dismiss. Calm persistence is harder to eradicate, but slower to reward. Behind closed doors, exhaustion sets in. Years of advocacy without resolution change people. The family marks time differently now. Every anniversary of the disappearance carries two weights: the loss itself and a reminder that nothing has moved. The traveler remains suspended in the same unresolved state as the system that absorbed them. Occasionally, a rumor surfaces suggesting progress. A document, a whistleblower, a lead. Each one raises hope briefly before collapsing under scrutiny. The pattern repeats often enough to become familiar. Hope arrives cautiously now, armored against disappointment. The hardest part is not knowing how to grieve properly. There's no body to mourn, no official acknowledgement of death, no certainty of survival. The traveler exists in a liminal category, neither alive nor gone, neither present nor past. This ambiguity infiltrates every aspect of remembrance. Even language becomes unstable. Is or was, are or were. Exposure without resolution traps the family in perpetual waiting. Publicly, the city resists reckoning. The facility is reframed as an edge case, an exception. Safeguards are emphasized. Oversight is promised again. The narrative shifts subtly from concern to reassurance. The goal becomes restoring confidence, not addressing harm. This reframing works. Tourism does not slow. The economy remains strong. The story recedes into background noise. New controversies replace it. The absence of visible fallout becomes proof, for many, that the issue was exaggerated. This is perhaps the system's greatest strength, its ability to survive revelation unchanged. What remains unresolved is not just the fate of the traveler, but the moral weight of the mechanism itself. The public is left with knowledge without responsibility, awareness without action, a quiet understanding that something exists beneath the surface that should not, but does. For the family, The story never ends. It loops. They continue to search, not because they expect success, but because stopping feels like betrayal. As long as they ask questions, the traveler remains present in the world in some form. Silence would finalize the disappearance in a way the system has not. There is a particular kind of loneliness that accompanies this fight. Advocacy isolates. Friends move on. Conversations grow repetitive. The family becomes defined by the absence, by the unresolved nature of their grief. They carry the story even when others would prefer to forget it. Sometimes they imagine what resolution would look like. Not justice, not punishment, just acknowledgement, a record, a sentence that begins with certainty. Even bad news would be something solid to hold. But that sentence never comes. Exposure without resolution leaves behind a different kind of ending, one that stretches indefinitely. The traveler's story becomes a warning rather than a case. Evidence not of individual wrongdoing, but of systemic indifference. The secret is no longer secret, but it is still protected. And in that space between knowing and doing, the disappearance remains suspended, unfinished, unresolved, and haunting in its persistence. The system has revealed itself just enough to survive. The traveler remains just out of reach. And that, perhaps, is the final cruelty. Not that the truth is hidden, but that it is visible without being actionable. A door opened, nothing retrieved, and silence once again resumes. Las Vegas at night looks the same as it always has. That is the most unsettling part. The lights still surge upward from the desert, bright enough to be seen from miles away. Defiant against the darkness that surrounds them, music spills from doorways. Traffic inches forward in endless lines. Laughter floats above the sidewalks in uneven bursts, rising and falling like static. The city does not slow. It does not pause to acknowledge what has been uncovered beneath it. Tourists arrive every hour, stepping into the glow with the same expectations the traveler once carried. Escape, indulgence, a few days suspended from consequence. They pose for photos beneath signs that promise fantasy and freedom. They never imagine that freedom here is conditional, that invisibility can work both ways. The Strip keeps its rhythm. Hotels cycle through guests. Rooms are cleaned, reassigned, occupied again. Beds are made with precision. Corners tucked tightly, as if order itself might erase what came before. Somewhere, a room once reserved for the traveler now belongs to someone else who has no reason to wonder who slept there last, or who didn't come back. This is how the city survives its secrets, not by denying them outright, but by absorbing them into continuity. Life continues, and continuation becomes the alibi. For the family, the city feels permanently altered. They can no longer see it as spectacle alone. Every corridor suggests a boundary. Every unmarked door feels charged. Every security checkpoint carries an unspoken question. Who decides what happens next? When they return, if they return, it is never as tourists. They walk differently now, slower, more attentive. They notice how easily public space gives way to private authority, how quickly warmth becomes distance, how often responsibility becomes abstract. Las Vegas teaches them something painful, that modern disappearance does not require chaos. It requires structure. The traveler's name still exists in databases, but not in outcomes. It appears in records of inquiry, in correspondence, in the margins of reports that promise review without resolution. The name is not erased, but it is never answered. This is the shape of the ending they are left with. Not closure, not justice, persistence. The family learns to live alongside the absence in ways that would have once felt impossible. They celebrate birthdays quietly, acknowledging the gap without naming it. They speak about the traveler in the present tense sometimes, not because they believe they are alive in any conventional sense, but because finality feels like surrender. Language becomes a careful negotiation. They do not say gone. They say missing. They do not say dead. They say unknown. These words leave room, not for hope exactly, but for honesty. They reflect the reality of a story that refuses to conclude. Over time, the world around them grows less patient. People prefer endings. They want stories that resolve, lessons that can be extracted and set aside. An unresolved disappearance is an emotional inconvenience. It lingers. It complicates conversations. It refuses to be archived. Gradually, fewer people ask questions. This is how forgetting begins, not through malice, but through fatigue. The city benefits from this. It always has. Las Vegas is built on renewal, on the promise that yesterday does not matter. What happens here is designed to dissolve into the next wave of arrivals. Memory is optional. Attention is temporary. The secret prison, once exposed, becomes just another uncomfortable footnote, a topic for late-night conversations, a reference point in think pieces that fade as new stories replace them. Its continued existence or evolution is no longer front-page news, and yet it remains, not necessarily in the same form, not necessarily in the same place. Systems like this adapt. They learn from exposure. They refine language, tighten procedures, improve deniability. Visibility does not end them. It teaches them how to survive scrutiny. That is perhaps the most haunting realization of all. The traveler's disappearance is not an anomaly. It is a warning signal that arrived quietly and was nearly missed. It reveals how easily a person can be removed from the narrative of their own life when systems prioritize order over accountability. No violence required. No malice necessary. Just process. At night, when the strip glows brightest, the city feels almost fragile in its excess. All that light pushing back against the dark. All that energy devoted to distraction. It feels in moments like these less like celebration and more like defense. As if brightness itself is meant to keep certain questions from forming. Somewhere beneath the surface, physically or metaphorically, there are spaces designed to hold what does not fit. People, problems, uncertainties. These spaces are not advertised. They do not appear on maps. They exist to ensure that the surface remains uninterrupted. Most people will never encounter them. That is the point. The traveler encountered something they were never meant to see. Or perhaps they were simply unlucky enough to cross a line that others passed without consequence. The distinction no longer matters. What matters is a result. A life suspended, a family left orbiting in absence, a question that refuses to settle. When people ask what happened, the family gives careful answers. They talk about the trip, the disappearance, the investigation, the exposure. They stop short of conclusions, not because they doubt their understanding, but because they have learned how quickly certainty is punished when it challenges powerful systems. They speak softly now, but they do not stop speaking. This is their resistance. The traveler's story lives on not in court rulings or official statements, but in memory, in cautionary whispers, in the quiet recalibration of how people understand safety in places that promise it. The story teaches that visibility is not protection, that surveillance does not guarantee care, that being surrounded by people does not mean you are seen. Las Vegas remains the same for most. But for those who know, it never looks quite as bright. The lights feel harsher now, more insistent. The music louder, less joyful. The illusion more obvious in its construction. The city still welcomes everyone, but it does not promise to keep them. In the end, there is no final image of the traveler, no recovered footage, no confirmed fate. The story closes without resolution because resolution was never offered. The system does not provide endings. It provides continuity. And continuity, when built on silence, becomes its own kind of cruelty. The traveler's disappearance does not end. It persists, quietly, steadily, woven into the infrastructure of a city that has learned how to forget without appearing to. Their absence becomes part of the background, like the hum of electricity beneath the strip, always there, rarely noticed. But once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. Every arrival now carries a shadow of that knowledge. Every departure feels slightly provisional. Every promise of safety feels conditional. Las Vegas keeps its secrets not because no one sees them, but because seeing is not enough. The city survives on motion, on replacement, on the assumption that tomorrow's arrivals will not ask about yesterday's missing. And most of the time, they don't. But somewhere beyond the lights and the noise, a family still waits. Not for miracles, not even for answers, just for acknowledgement that a person mattered enough to be accounted for. That acknowledgement never comes. The strip continues to glow. The story remains unfinished, and the disappearance, decades later, still has no place to land, except in the uneasy space between what is known and what is allowed to be said.